So let's continue with part 2 with our discussion. And Dr. Cousens, you made a great point. You said, I think we all at this point understand the problems, and maybe let's talk somewhat about the solution. But before we do that, I think that today's lectures by Robert Whitaker and Irving Kirsch really went into detail on the specific classification of drugs, of antidepressants, and what's it actually called? Is it antidepressants, or is it also antipsychotics, or antidepressants? So when you say antidepressants, the antipsychotics and anti-anxiety is not part of that?
No.
Or is it the same thing? Different class. Okay. So we talked about antidepressants. But for those of us here who hear this and hear all the problems with making decisions about drugs, is there anything you want to say about other drugs that you're as clear on? In other words, there are statin drugs, there are other types of drugs. Are there other drugs that you have as much clarity that you could say with certainty that we should be very, very careful and conscious aside from just antidepressants?
Well, I'd like to address that one because I also sold statin drugs. And I sold one of the older statin drugs, and when the current market leader came out, we were very concerned as a field reps. You know, we were in our meeting and we're like, oh my goodness, this drug lowers cholesterol up to 47%. How are we supposed to sell this dog drug that we have now? Because usually when a new drug comes onto the market, physicians are very quick to adapt prescribing the new drug because there's lots of marketing hoopla that goes with, you know, the launch of the product. And so we were all concerned about our market shares because that's the way that reps get paid bonus money. And so, again, that was one of the times I learned that we had friends in the FDA because I was told, well, the district manager said, you guys don't need to worry about this. We have an approach how we're going to combat this because, you know, this new drug could be problematic. And we're like, problematic in what way? Well, you know, you can lower cholesterol too much, and because cholesterol is the most common organic molecule in the entire body and brain, you can wreak havoc in all the other body systems if you lower cholesterol too much. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, I've learned that all individuals respond differently to these drugs. How do we know what is too much for an individual with any drug? And, you know, he's like, well, we really don't know that. We just know that. And he starts educating me, and they bring this marketing perspective in. This is how we combat the competition. And they start telling us all this negative information about the damage that statins do. And this is the first time in 3 years I've heard about it. So I'm like, oh, wow. So now I realize that, you know, these drugs maybe aren't the cure-all, be-all, end-all for the treatment of MI because it's actually, cholesterol is a risk factor. It's not even a disease. And so when they really started giving me the true, fair, balanced information that they were saying that we were supposed to be presenting to physicians, I realized that the statin drugs were indeed a very problematic category of drugs. But then the other thing that I was told was that you don't need to worry about that because you know what you do if you want more pie. And that's like, no. It's like if you want a bigger piece of the pie. And I said, no, what do? You bake a bigger pie. So our friends in the FDA, we found that if you lower LDL below 100, that there's fewer heart attacks. And so we're having the clinical standards revised. So overnight, they tripled the population of patients that were available for statin drugs.
I have a little bit different experience about statins. Diabetes is a particular area of interest for me, and the research is showing that statins increase your rate of getting diabetes from somewhere, depending on the research, between 48 and 80%. And obviously that means raising your blood sugar. Now, the thing that's interesting is a little bit about what we're talking about with the psychiatric drugs. When we talk about manic depressant for 2-year-olds, is that what are we talking about really manic depressive for 2 years? Or are we just talking about fairly normal kids being kind of on the edge and being diagnosed that way? So we're creating a disease that doesn't exist. And then we'll treat it pharmacologically. So the research over the last 30 years on the whole thing on cholesterol has shown one very clear thing, as it was published in the Archives of Internal Medicine, pretty major journal, in 2009, which is both random studies and cohort studies. None have shown any association between your cholesterol levels and heart disease and heart attacks. That's 30 years of studies. Now, the whole statin thing has been created for a world that doesn't exist. It's like a fantasy world that's been created that we're treating a problem that isn't a problem. And it's a pretty big seller. Now, there are some problems with statins, right? Besides the diabetes, they increase their rates of stroke and Parkinson's disease and cognitive decline, muscle aches and pains.
Cancer.
And there are lots of lists, but I think it's interesting the amount of lives saved by statins equal the amount of lives of people who die by taking statins. Kind of break even. So it's like a total mythology that's been created for a disease that doesn't exist in relationship to the cholesterol. It's really interesting. In fact, women with a cholesterol of 270 and higher live 28% longer, 270 I said, right? I didn't say 170, 270, than women with a cholesterol of 193 or less. So the data, this is pretty significant. That was a study of 52,000 people in Norway. So what are we going to say as we start to look at, again, creating myths, basically lies about what you need to take care of yourself, when there's no connection. So we have a lot of problems with a lot of the drugs. It's creating a use for something that doesn't really exist. So it's pretty significant. And a lot of harm that comes out of that.
Dr. Cousins, let's go off topic just for one quick second, so there's no confusion. You're saying that the higher levels of cholesterol are not concerning you, but on the other hand, you're not recommending people eat animal products that raise their cholesterol. So just to
No, you don't want to go out of your way to raise your cholesterol. And really, we have to understand that 80% of the cholesterol our own body makes. Okay. And what I found in my diabetic study of 120 people is that we really dropped naturally eating a healthy way. It naturally drops to about 159, 160, which is a decent and safe level. No, I'm not suggesting we go for cholesterol, but people's physiology is different. There's people eating the same diet and it can be, 260, and the people eating the same diet and it could be 160. There are variations because we're unique, so we don't want to make pathology out of what isn't pathology. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. So to go further with the same question I just asked, if we've talked about antidepressants and we've talked about statins, there's a whole list of other drugs. I don't know anything about them. Sometimes my dad's on like 12 different drugs. My mom's on a bunch of drugs. A lot of people I know are on drugs. I don't know anything about them. But so far what we've discussed was very discouraging in terms of feeling confident that that we have all the information on them. So is there anything to say about any other categories of drugs that we know of?
Well, the thing that really needs to be said is as we move out of the paradigm, better living through chemistry, and we move towards the paradigm, better living through better living, a lot of the problems that people have can really be healed in a way that uplifts people with no side effects. Take high blood pressure. That's very easily treated in natural ways. I'm not going to get into the ways. Take depression. Can any antidepressant talk about a 90% success rate? No. So our answer to a certain way is that there are natural ways to naturally heal people without all the downsides. And what's interesting is they're all the better for it because they've uplifted their quality of life and are more living a full life on all levels, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritually. That's a value. So when we go away from drugs, we start to move towards an evolutionary way of being. So that, in a way, is a way of getting people, let's say, more interested. But to do that, and this is one of the problems, you have to love yourself enough to want to heal yourself. Mm-hmm. Fundamental. And what we see in America, and America is the biggest drug user in the world. Mm-hmm. Over 70% of Americans are using some pharmaceutical. That's a lot, okay? And it's like, oh my goodness. Teenagers over 12 in the teen range are taking an average of 1.2 brain-altering medications. That's every single teenager in the country. I mean, not every single teenager is taking drugs, but when you look at the picture, it averages out that. So these are horrendous type of statistics. More drugs in the United States than anywhere in the world. Okay, and what are we talking about? Meaning and value of life. So what we do have some answers to is, or let's say questions is, what is your life about? What are you here on the planet for? And beginning to promote health, well-being, and consciousness as an approach. Now, one of the things we talk about with the antidepressants, the SSRIs in specific, is they create a subtle, I'm going to use the term lobotomy, okay? That when we look at the big crimes that have been done with teenagers killing people in the schools, the majority, the vast majority of those kids are on antidepressants. So I don't want to go through every single one, but the point is pretty much every one. Now what's going on? So these are people that through the drugs have been alienated, then they've got this akathisia that pushes them towards 3 times more suicide and homicide. What's happening for people? Have we lost our connection with what life is about? And that's what we're seeing. So instead of seeing life as an evolutionary thing, it's like take a drug and go numb. And that affects our way we relate to people, it relates intimacy, the whole society in many serious ways is breaking down. So these are some of the issues that the drugs are both a cause and a reflection of. So I'm raising the questions on a kind of much bigger level. This is a national and international disaster, the way this is going. And maybe the drug companies, maybe they want to make their profit and all that, but it's out of hand. The ethics have gotten lost along the way, and the purpose of life gets lost too. So this is really what the whole world faces. U.S. is a great leader in this. It's #1 in drug taking. So these are the questions I'm raising, is like, how do we look at this? How do we turn this around? How do we change the value system that says you're put on the planet to grow spiritually, to have meaning and value? These are things that are being forgotten. And the result is intimacy is breaking down. There's like, well, since the 1960s, you're talking double the amount of divorce and triple the amount of suicide among teens, triple the amount of suicide among teens, okay? 4 times more violence, 5 times more people in jail, 10 times more depression than the 1960s. So what is going on? So we need to look at it with a more global perspective. And drugs are taking us way away from any kind of awake global perspective.
Again, on a side note, is it a great concern that people are peeing pharmaceutical drugs into our water systems? Is this a significant concern that's getting into our drinking water? And
it's not a problem if you have a good water filter, I guess.
okay.
Then again, what are the animals eating? What are the cows having, in their milk? It's like, it's a huge problem. Yeah. And the fish in the rivers are having all kinds of abnormalities based on these hormonal abnormalities. It's not a humorous side effect, but it's a very important side effect because it's affecting our whole ecology.
My father lives in Las Vegas, and he recently sent an article to me to show me that the fish in Lake Mead are no longer reproducing because they're now asexual. They can't reproduce, so they have to restock Lake Mead all the time, and it's because of all of the pharmaceuticals and the antidepressants and the birth control pills that are found in the water when they test it.
You may or may not know that the antidepressants drop your libido somewhere between 30 and 60%. So that may be happening with the fish too, I don't know.
So each of you wrote a book about depression. It's about this exact topic. It's a very unique situation to have 4 people that wrote about this. So you've already discussed this, you researched it, you've spoken about it, you actually took the time to think about this, write about it, and you wrote a book. So what happened? Like, we're having this conference thinking that we're going to break through, we're going to tell people new information, things are going to change. You actually wrote a book, you got national publicity. What happens after you write a book about groundbreaking things and you communicate all this great information? What happens from that?
I can tell you one thing that, is this on? Yeah, I can tell you one thing that happened and one thing that I think will happen. The one thing that happened is something that happened to me personally. It was at least one psychiatrist who was planning on doing a clinical trial with me as part of the group doing the clinical trial was warned, if you ever want to get funded for clinical trials, don't have Kirsch be a co-author or one of the grant applicants on your clinical trial. So that's one thing that happened. It doesn't bother me. I've never gotten any drug company funding at all for some reason. I haven't figured out why that is. But I think the change will be slow. Change in medicine often is slow. And I've seen a couple of examples of it in different areas with surgical procedures that took a long time to change, despite data like the data we have for the drugs. But I will predict to you that 50 years from now, well, not me, I won't be around probably, but as a culture, as a society, we will look back at what David Healy called the antidepressant era, and we will look back at the prescription of these drugs the same way we now look at bloodletting as a medical procedure. That's my prediction.
Well, I can say from my personal experience that I've gotten some media attention, and early on I was invited to be on the Dr. Oz show. I was on the Dr. Oz show and I was in the audience, and then they heavily edited what I was allowed to say during the show. I mean, when it actually aired, only about a third of what I had said came out. And then Dr. Oz read my book, and he invited me to come back on the show and actually had me on stage with him for a segment of the show. And that's the show that's never aired. Oh. So, and there's been other circumstances which, I'm suspicious about, I can't actually prove, and since I don't like to be labeled a conspiracy theorist, I'd much rather be labeled a public intelligence analyst. I found that lots of speaking engagements and other things that I had been invited to would just disappear into thin air for no given reason, and they would be canceled, or I was blocked from getting any information from .edus when pharmacy schools were asking me to come and speak. So they find ways to suppress the information. And I'd just like to add something to that, because I don't want everyone here to think that we're just up here bashing the drug companies because we have some other vested interest in doing so. And a gentleman approached me after the first segment and said, you know, there's doctors in the audience, and they're very concerned about the fact that, why don't you have a drug rep up there on the panel, someone else to give an opposing point of view? And I would like to address that question for him, and I would just like to say, I'm sure they would probably not be allowed to attend a conference like this, because they are only allowed to parrot the company bylines, and they train and they practice to make sure that every single word that comes out of their mouths is something that the company would legally approve. So I don't believe that you're going to get that kind of participation from people that don't want to come forward and be forthright about the truth.
You know, I've actually seen some, I mean, I'm generally a complete pessimist, but every once in a while I get a moment of optimism. You know, the conversation is changing in this country around psychiatric drugs, at least at the grassroots level. I think a lot of people are much more wary of them, even though the drug use, it seems like it keeps on going up and up. I mean, I think it's 1 in 5 Americans now takes a psych drug on a daily basis. And anyway. But nevertheless, the conversation is changing. I think actually in psychiatric circles, there's increasing recognition away from the public that they do have a problem with the long-term effects, that the drugs aren't that effective over the short term. So I think a conversation, the national conversation is changing, and actually the recognition within psychiatric circles is changing. Believe it or not, I mean, I've had my own sort of like you're a horrible human being moments, but I've also been asked to give grand rounds to a number of psychiatric departments at medical schools. And I will tell you, when you give grand rounds, while the older doctors are really furious with you, because you're sort of, you know, the residents are there and they feel like sort of almost humiliated because what has been taught now you're saying is wrong and sort of led psychiatry down a bad path. But the residents often are very receptive, the younger people, to sort of thinking of new ways. And the optimism comes from, ultimately it's not going to come from top down. I don't think you're going to see the medical profession really making big changes. But there's a lot of grassroots rebellion against this. And I think also we were talking around with the treatment of kids. I think the medicating of kids stirs an instinctual sort of, can this really be good for kids? And then, you know, when you hear about 4-year-olds on drugs, you just know something's not right. And I actually think here's the switch that's coming. You know, we have existed in an environment where, well, in psychiatry, to think about what's wrong with us, right? You're really always on guard for some symptom, some emotion that is supposedly not right. But even if you go into medicine at large, oh, your statins, you know, your cholesterol levels aren't quite right, and so there's a lot of looking at what's wrong with you and then treating the symptoms of, say, too high cholesterol or whatever it might be. I think the switch that's coming really is, how do we stay healthy? And a lot more, you know, I think actually what's going on here is a seed for a much larger movement. And instead of figuring out what's wrong with ourselves and how do we get rid of the symptom of this or that, is how do we stay healthy? And I think there's growing understanding that food is an important thing. I mean, go to young people like in Brooklyn and other places. They all want to eat organic food and they want to eat, you know, look at the success of Whole Foods. You have Whole Foods down here?
Yep.
Look at the success of Whole Foods, and it's all about better, you know, animals and plants. So I actually am a little optimistic that maybe we're in the beginnings of a real switch in terms of, you even talked about what it means to be human and how we view ourselves. And instead of thinking about treating diseases all the time and illnesses, is, well, how do we eat? What do we need to do to stay well? And if that happens, I think you could get a real shift in society at large, how we raise our kids. And hopefully that's the seed that's taking hold. Anyway, it gives me a moment when I can escape my own pessimism.
My book, Depression Free for Life by HarperCollins, was received pretty well. My audience is a little different. So I got on lots of radio shows and so forth like that because it's more alternate media, so to speak. And so I'm speaking to a little bit different world who's already kind of what you're talking about, moving in that direction. And it's very important that that public be empowered because it's like increasing the cutting edge. And when people know that there's a way to heal your depression naturally, that's way more successful and, of course, a whole lot less dangerous, and you actually get healthy in the process, that's very attractive. And so as we look at the big picture, which is what you're talking about, there are more and more people who are actually starting to love themselves enough to want to heal themselves. You know, so you've kind of heard me say that now, but it's a key thing. So it has to do with self-esteem, it has to do with consciousness, and as that increases, people are more and more interested. Now, there's one other thing. People generally go with what works. And I don't remember exactly how long ago it was, but the New England Journal came out with a whole statistic about how like $30 billion a year is now going into alternative medicine. I think it was like, I don't know, at least 6 years, 7 years ago, I'm not sure, but probably longer. And it's like there's a competition. And this also happened, I actually remember it in 72, where there started to be a focus on home deliveries. And you know what happened? Suddenly the hospital started to create home delivery-like settings. So the public can create demands that are moving towards health, and there's a certain economics with it that goes on that we've seen, from home birthing and that kind of thing, to actually a much more health-oriented approach. I think that the anti-GMO movement is a statement like, we actually want to eat good food. We really don't want to eat food that's going to poison us. So stop. Now, part of the thing is, it is an economic struggle. When people say, I don't want GMO food, they know, when they want labeling, they really, really know that if they're labeled, that's the end of the story. Nobody's going to want to buy it, because they know what it is. And so that consciousness is there. Of course, we go a step further and just say, make them illegal, like in Russia. GMO is not legal. Okay, so because they have a particular concern about organic, healthy food. And so all this is happening, and our role is to keep encouraging on all the levels that people move in a more healthy direction. So I think that's all part of the story. So, and then what is considered alternative media begins to be more and more everyday media. And so we have to shift that. We also shift it by being active, intelligent, conscious consumers. So those are ways that I see going on with that.
Okay, as I ask this next question, I would love to invite anyone who would like to ask a question to that microphone. So I'll continue asking questions, but please join us over there if you have a question. We'd love to hear from you. We've been talking about drugs, but what about other medical procedures like, I don't know, gastric bypass, mammograms, x-rays? Is there anything that we are being encouraged to do, that it's possible we're being encouraged to do, that actually wouldn't be in our long-term best interest, but is just part of this whole system that it's good for business? Is there anything that comes to mind?
One of the things we see, I'm more part of the holistic health movement and holistic physicians around the country, and things like, we were talking about the myth of cholesterol like 10 years ago. You know, this is not like new, so there's a cutting edge. The mammograms, there's enough in there that I think shows they're actually dangerous, and I think many of the, mainline physicians are also not in a hurry to do mammograms and so forth. So I think the public and kind of, there's an openness to going away from procedures that actually may be harmful. You know, so I think that's kind of the trend.
You know, I'm not going to talk about specific examples because I don't know that much, but there's a great book called Overtreated. I mean, there's no question that the amount of medical services we use is extraordinary. I mean, I think the health industry is something like 18% or 17% of the gross national product now. It used to be, if you go back, like 4%. And one of the things you do see happening is in the 60s, so the drug industry grows up on antibiotics. I mean, that's what really makes the drug industry powerful. And antibiotics, as Irving said today, they're fantastic for bacterial infections, right? There's no placebo response. But then after they got up, you know, they grow up on antibiotics, and then in the 60s they start realizing, I'm talking about the drug companies, that where you can have therapies that people stay on endlessly, that's much more profitable than a therapies that, you know, you take acutely for a little while. And that's when we start getting all this stuff for like, you know, where you start seeing like, they set standards. This is supposed to be your cholesterol. If you fall below it, then you got to take a drug and that sort of thing. And then we get the hormone replacement therapies and the drugs to strengthen, you know, the anti-aging therapies. And next thing you know, I think the average 70-year-old is on 4 drugs, something crazy like that. Well, clearly, I don't know about specific drugs, but we're over-treating people like crazy. And it's not like you see a healthier population. You don't see diabetes going down, that sort of thing. So I think what you really see is a healthcare delivery system that's a bit out of control. And it is about selling services so often. And you know, if you go to the surgeon with a back problem, what's he going to tell you? It's going to be, he's going to tell you probably need the surgery, right? And the guy who offers another thing might offer an alternative thing. So the idea, are we over-treated, say it that way, with a lot of ineffective therapies being done? Absolutely. And there's a great piece by Atul Gawande in New Yorker recently about how hard it is for doctors to do nothing, but often they're just not primed to do nothing, but often doing nothing is the best response. And that's something that medicine, I think, needs to rediscover or learn.
Hi, my question is, I know we're talking about depression and drugs and everything else and how it goes on with more depression. What do you have to say about the electronics and the technology today? I have a new grandchild who is he just turned 4, and they always seem to give him an iPad. It's an automatic babysitter. And my daughter's friends are all into the laptop, the cell phone, and all her friends are depressed. Are the doctors taking any of that into account with this? I mean, it scares me. Technology actually, I don't see it as a good thing. I think it does create depression. Am I wrong?
I don't think there've been, let's just talk about cell phones. It's pretty clear they're bad for people. Most of the research is not in this country, but we know there's a significant increase in cancer, particularly parotid gland cancer, on the side they're using it on. I think the electromagnetics are associated with a whole lot of problems, but it's hard to just put it there because we look at radiation, and you're definitely going to have increased, without a doubt, increased depression, diabetes, thyroid problems. So it's getting to be mixed, but clearly the electronics are really, the research in the next 10 years is we're going to see an epidemic of cancer that we don't want to have to see, because it's going to be young people. It's 10 years, 12 years of cell phones that we're going to see. It's not good in terms of viability. So these are really serious issues. And we try to, my book on conscious parenting, I really point out a lot of the serious downsides. And what I try to do is get parents to minimize the use, when you really look at statistics, you shouldn't be using a cell phone hardly at all, but at least not till you're 18. Well, how realistic is that in our world? Okay, but get what we're saying. You know, when we look at the hardcore statistics, it's not good in terms of outcome of 10 years of cell phone use, in terms of cancer and and immune system problems and so forth. It's a hard one because people are looking at convenience and safety issues. There's some truth to that. You want your kid to have something to be safe with. But the convenience thing is, and the whole world interaction. Think about electromagnetics. How about intimacy? People are relating over their internet. And that's a big deal now. It's like, what happened to relationships? So it's changing our whole culture, not necessarily in an evolutionary way. So there are big problems and not a lot of pushback on it.
I just want to see, Irving earlier said he doesn't talk about anything if he doesn't know it really well. Unfortunately, I don't have that hesitancy on the subject. No, I'm actually, this is one of my sort of next book projects, is like the science of raising healthy children. And one of the things you start finding out when you do the research, for example, when you look at brain development in young children, they're geared to look at faces. In other words, and also to be with people of different ages. So in other words, we are geared to be involved with other humans. And so I think anything that takes us away or diminishes that involvement with other humans and how we learn, such as all this technological stuff for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, it's a mistake from that way, because they're not even getting the input that they're designed by evolution to get. And I have a new granddaughter who's 18 months, and they just soak up social interactions. They are sponges for social interaction, and they do love different faces. They love to hear different voices, and I'm pretty sure an iPad, and I see it all the time, doesn't replace the richness of a human interaction.
Well, I also see that in social media. Like, I have a younger daughter who's I also have a daughter, as I said, who's a younger daughter who's in college. And the social media, the kids seem to get really affected by what goes on Facebook. I mean, somebody says something and they're devastated and they go into these moods. I see it so much. That's the other thing.
Anyway, I agree with that too. It's a problem.
Thank you for all the wonderful information you've provided. I've got a question that I'd like to ask the panel. There are some kids that I'm familiar with who are kids from parents who are drug addicts, mothers who are addicted to drugs. And these 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7-year-olds are under the care of psychiatrists, and they're put on Ritalin, Risperdal, and all the drugs that you have mentioned. How would you suggest that the parents, because I've talked to the parents and tell them these kids need to come off these drugs, but it makes the kids calm and it makes the kid function in school, and their parents are refusing to even listen to what I have to say. What would you suggest that these parents do?
It's a tough one. As I was talking about before, the parents are involved in the convenience. The kid will maybe perform better, they're going to be better behaved, their learning doesn't improve. The research doesn't really show that. But in the end, the long-term use of these things, like Ritalin is a long-acting cocaine. Now let's be real clear about it. The research shows it. And so what you see when you get to be a teenager and people are switching now from Ritalin to cocaine and more alcohol use, this is not a good result, okay? And that's part of the problem, is that you're creating a lifelong addiction. And so that sometimes gets parents to pay attention. You're not really helping them. I think the other thing, there isn't as much research as I'd like to see, is that it does alter the brain, and we actually don't know the extent of that. But if we look at adults with already mature brains, okay, and we see it alters their ability, and we see, like with the SSRIs, the subtle lobotomy that goes on with kids where they lose their human connection they get detached. We start using those drugs in younger kids. I don't think we have to guess that it's going to have a significant effect on interpersonal relationships and in brain development and on physical development, and I'll also say psychosocial development. So pretty much across the board, these kids are being affected, and I haven't seen any really good research on it because it needs to be long-term. We're just entering into this kind of drug craziness. So maybe another 10 years before somebody comes out with that. So those are the things, though. If you want your kid to, how much higher percentage to turn out to be an addict and drug addicted and altered brain function, this is the way to do it.
What would you suggest the treatment modality be then if they can't have the drug?
75% of kids with these problems are cured by good nutrition and increased nutrient base, 75%. Plus you have to do with allergies and you have to do with electronic sensitivity, but there's a lot of things going on. You have to deal with neutralizing radiation, but 75%. Now, that's just in general.
Okay.
I say some of us are getting 90%. Okay, well, that's better, but it's still, it's very treatable. So I think we need to understand that these so-called childhood things, you know, as a result of what I call toxic synergy to the brain of the child, we can do a lot. So I want to just kind of emphasize that part of it. Okay, but it also means the parents have to work harder.
Okay.
They have to, because they have to change too. A lot of resistance is, hey, change the kid, don't change me.
Thank you.
So parents, unfortunately, do need to live a healthy lifestyle if they expect that their kids to live that. And that's a big deal. And the other part of that little story, the research has shown this, that if parents are the model. So if parents aren't living a healthy lifestyle, they're really communicating that to the child. If they're living a healthy lifestyle, it's a much higher percentage of the children who will, of their children that will follow in those footsteps. So these are big, really, really pivotal issues in our society at this point.
Hi there. Thank you all for standing up and for the people rather than the pharmacy and telling us like it how it really is. Thank you. Greatly appreciated. I was wondering why herbs, natural herbs, ayahuasca, iboga, cannabis, the plant, why the natural plants haven't been looked at. I had a friend with post-traumatic stress disorder who went outside the box, went to Colombia. She got on a ayahuasca where she really reflected on all of her post-traumatic. She's a CNN reporter. She's got a website, reset.me, where she faced all of her fears and she sweated it all out and threw up, and just really, it helped her move forward from all of her stress without any addiction or long-term side effects. Also, other people with experiences with cannabis, removing all their death, you know, from deaths and just overcoming depression. All natural products rather than synthetic medicines that last a lifetime.
Gwen, you're the drug developer.
Well, I guess this is an area I tried to stay out of for a long time because people want you to get into the cannabis debate, and I tried to stay away from that just because I thought that it would possibly taint the information that I was trying to present. However, I would like to make this statement that in my research I found the patent for cannabis, which is held by the US government, and all of the medicinal qualities that it claims that marijuana has. So from my experience in seeing, for example, being inside pharma and being concerned myself as a rep as to, well, what are we supposed to do now that we've got all of these natural remedies on the market and things like that? How are we supposed to address those with physicians? And we were told, don't worry about it because, you know, if we can't beat them, we'll buy them. And if we can't buy them, we'll put them out of business. Well, that has the same thing to do, that's the agenda behind keeping these plants and these other alternative treatments illegal and putting a stigma around them so that you will not experiment or research or try any of these other things, but yet in my research, I found that there are quite a number of places that you can go and have these experiences, and they seem to, on the face of it, have very good results. But, I would be hesitant to recommend ayahuasca or iboga myself because I haven't taken either of them. And I'm one of those kind of individuals that that's why I had so many problems. I was popping the things I had in my trunk. So, I can't personally speak to that, but I do believe that we're seeing the reversal of the trend of marijuana being illegal. And I think it's just like we said about anything else. It's a societal pressure that will make these things available to the public. And we have to shift our paradigm of thinking, just like, when we were smoking in society and it was acceptable to be, in a room with other people that didn't smoke and smoking, and we finally found out that these things cause health issues even in secondary, smoke. We need to make a paradigm shift, and we need to make these things more available by making it unacceptable for people to pop drugs, the first thing. And we should make it where we should try everything else, and we should exhaust all alternatives, including our lifestyle changes, before we embrace drugs. So that's drugs in one other aspect, but they are herbs, but that's the most information that I can give you about it.
Thank you.
Can I just tell a joke?
Please do.
No, obviously there's a larger narrative around this, right? In the 70s, the drugs that you take for pleasure are bad drugs, and the prescribed drugs are good drugs. In other words, we had this anti-drug campaign of marijuana. Remember the things with the egg? You're probably too young for this. But they used to be, this is your brain on drugs. It was like a fried egg, that sort of thing. But here's what it was explained to me, the difference between plant-based drugs like the ones you talked about, and prescribed drugs. People will pay with their own money to take the first class of drugs. They'll only take the second class of drugs, the prescribed psychiatric drugs, if somebody else pays for them. In other words, that's the point. These are drugs that people actually like. They're seen as addictive, that sort of thing. And it comes in a narrative, those are harmful, the prescribed drugs are good for you. You have to switch that narrative a bit before you really explore the possibilities. The joke fell flat.
Thank you. I was dealing with 2 benign tumors in my head. My choice is lose my hearing or try alternatives. So cannabis oil came to mind. I'm in California, medical card. And I just had lost my mother, so I was very, very sad and depressed. I couldn't figure out how to get out of it. I'm a happy person. I was like, what the heck? And I'm like, lose my hearing, cut your head open, lose your balance nerve, possibly have eye issues, face paralyzed. So I definitely took it. It's passed. I took it for 6 months in California where it's legal, and came off it 10 days, way down, felt awful. And now I sleep much earlier. I have dreams. I can talk. My throat's back. My face isn't paralyzed anymore. I have feelings over here. Dr. William Courtney was in the room. I don't know if he's still here. He's the leader in this, and it just has been tremendous. I don't care to get back on it at all, ever. But what it's done, it took away my depression completely, gone. It's outside of me. I can look over and say, okay, that was. Now I'm different, seem to create new pathways, no addiction. I'm done. So it really was helpful. Thank you.
Oh, it's okay, I'll pass.
First, I wanted to give a testimonial for Dr. Cousens in his book, Depression Free for Life, and then I have 2 questions. So about 15 years ago, I have a friend who was a heroin addict, and he'd been clean and sober for 7 years. And he would call me up and say, it's about this time in recovery where drug addicts, recovering addicts start committing suicide. And, at first I thought, well, you wouldn't do that. You're clean and sober, why would you do that? But after about the 15th or 30th time that I heard him say, this is about time when we start committing suicide, I started thinking, okay, maybe there is an issue. And Dr. Cousens was coming into town because his book, Depression Free for Life, had just come out, and he was doing a 1-day workshop. And so I paid for Howie to go because he wasn't making that much money, because he was really scattered because he was a recovering heroin addict. And apparently there's only a 3% survival rate for a heroin addict. And so he went to Dr. Cousens' talk, and he explained what his situation was. And Dr. Cousens says, well, we'd love to have you come down to our Tree of Life Rejuvenation Center. And he's like, well, I just can't afford that. So Dr. Cousens asked him a series of questions to determine, what he says is, first you have to figure out what kind of diet you need. Is it slow oxidizer or fast oxidizer? And then he said, okay, instead of, recommending a whole bunch of expensive supplements, he just said, okay, go to Whole Foods, this is what your diet's going to be, and pour flaxseed over it. And I saw my friend Howie about 3 months later, and he was like calm. I mean, which was not normal for Howie. He's always, schizoid. I don't know if schizoid's the right word, but he was always, very hyperactive. And then I saw him again about 9 months later, and he was hyperactive again. And I said, well, what happened? And we started talking, and he said, oh my gosh, I went back to, the junk food diet, eating sugar and chocolate and all that kind of stuff. And he went back to the diet that Dr. Cousens had recommended, and he was calm again. So I highly recommend, his book, Depression Free for Life. So I have a question. I was diagnosed about 2 years ago with ADHD, and I'm vegan, and they've recommended that I take tyrosine, which is, of course, made from chicken feathers. What would you recommend that I take in place of tyrosine to increase my dopamine?
There's a lot of things, but I kind of want to not start prescribing.
Okay.
Because he read this whole thing about you're not supposed to do that.
Okay.
But generally, as you get more balanced, you'll start producing more of that. But that's a vague question, a vague answer. So,
Okay.
But that's as far as I think we should go.
Okay, that sounds fine. So then the other question would be, in general, for people who are already on, like, pharmaceutical, antidepressants, et cetera, and they wanted to do a more holistic approach, I understand that it can be dangerous for them to just try and get off of their pharmacy drugs and try to do the holistic approach. What would you how do they do that?
Some of the work I do all the time. And it's a little tricky because you can get some serious withdrawal, you can get depression, you can get suicide, you can get anxiety, you can get a lot of mental confusion. They're very real things because, remember what Stephen Hyman said, head of NIMH, it creates a perturbation of your neurotransmitter system. So you've disrupted the neurotransmitter system, you've disrupted the physical structure of the brain. And incidentally, I kind of withheld on the marijuana thing, but I want to be very clear that medical use is very different than ongoing use. There's a significant amount of research out there that actually shows that the learning curve for teenagers taking marijuana, their psychosocial development is significantly disrupted, their ability for intimacy is disrupted, and their kind of maturation of their brain is disrupted and actually doesn't quite get online. That's just one little thing. 1 hour after you have marijuana, there's a 3 times increased incidence of a heart attack. There's a list of things. I don't want to get into it, but I don't want us to go away thinking marijuana is just safe. It isn't. I have very clear brain scans where we're showing significant destruction of vital structures of the brain for marijuana and alcohol and cocaine. There's no research on ayahuasca. So I don't want to I want to take it a different way because to me it's all drugs. And yes, is it better? Yes. Can you get healing? Well, I can find people who got healing from psychopharmacology, but not much. So I'm trying to look at a different way, which is how do we rebuild the system that works for everybody, okay? And that's really the answer. I want to cite a research by Dr. Stephen Schoenthal. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of him, but what he did is he went in the prison system and he took, the control group and the non-control group, and he gave them adequate nutrition. And those who received the adequate nutrition had significantly improved social interaction, significantly less violent interaction. What am I saying here? So that was with the prison thing. I mean, it was very dramatic what he did. I'm saying that a lot of what we're seeing in the world is inadequate nutrition. So the real answer that I'm giving you on depression and all these things is let's rebuild the system. Now that's not the only thing because there's psycho-spiritual aspects, but the most important thing I think for you in that question is living and creating a diet that will rebuild your system in a way that's going to really improve your overall health in every aspect. Well, because what I see, and a little bit what happened with your friend, is he got healthy and his symptoms went away. Now we can look at alcoholism, which is a very big issue which we haven't touched on, and 2/3 of the people have a D2A1 allele disruption, where they aren't producing enough dopamine. Aha! And then people start doing all these things to get more dopamine, more sex, more violence, more trauma, more, more alcohol, because it has it creates another drug that kind of makes it look like dopamine, to get that stimulation. Okay, so what we see with alcoholism, but all of them, is a very different approach when you have adequate nutrition, where you start making more of dopamine. What's the difference? There's 617 studies where basically the average is, after a year with the different programs, not a nutritional approach, you're going to get 25% success rate, and after 4 years it's 7%. Okay, if you do adequate nutritional healing, first of all, that really begins to treat the anxiety, depression, and suicidal. You're getting a 75%, a 92% healing in the first year, and 75% by year 3 and 4. That's 10 times better results. There is no substitute for rebuilding your system, having adequate nutrition, and what happens is you begin to produce more dopamine. And that's the key, because as I say with alcoholics, they are literally not producing enough dopamine, and their receptors there's less dopamine receptors by 1/3 to 2/3, and they're not producing enough enkephalin and so forth. So, okay, what's my point? There are things, by taking your neurotransmitter into consideration, that can improve your dopamine. Okay, there are different herbs that can do it, and I'm again not trying to prescribe herbs. I'm holding off on that. So you can, by being healthy, number one, by two, taking certain natural herbs plus things that stimulate dopamine production. You don't need tyrosine. You can do other things that will improve your dopamine production. Okay, and then what you're doing is you're activating your pleasure centers. This is what dopamine does, and that's the way to go, and you'll get a lot of success in that. Now people say, oh, heroin can't be healed, and cocaine can't be healed. It's not true. But you got to repair the system. You got to get the hypothalamic pituitary system going. You have to have the thyroid system going. You have to have the adrenals going. You have to have adequate, overall nutrition, your iodine, your, oxygen, everything has to start working. And then you will naturally start producing more dopamine. So that's really the tried and true approach.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'd like to also address the question that you asked about getting off of antidepressants, given the problem of antidepressant withdrawal syndrome and the problem of increased risk that may have been of relapse onto depression that may have been a product of the antidepressant use. There's an excellent book that I would recommend. It was written by Joe Glenmullen, who's also an affiliate at Harvard University. It's on how to get off of antidepressant drugs. It's it's an excellent book both for people who want to get off or for doctors who want to help their patients get off of antidepressants. Do you remember the exact name of the book? It's something like how to get off of antidepressants.
How to get rid of Prozac, I think it was.
Something. No, that's not.
No, that's
not
not
it.
You're talking about Glenn Mullen, right?
Joe Glenmullen.
Yeah.
He's got 2 books. If you just look him up on any of book site, Glenmullen, and that will give you, I think, the most reliable and helpful answer to the question that you're asking.
Talking back to Prozac, you sure that wasn't the title?
could be, but,
I think there are two books, and one of them, I think, is
First one might be talking back
That-
to Prozac.
right, and then a sec, right, exactly.
Oh, okay.
And then there's withdrawal.
I don't know if you could hear, what did you say?
No, he has, his first book, I think, is talking back to Prozac, but that's the problems with Prozac by Joe Glenn Mullen. But then Irving, as Irving says, he's got a second book, but I can't remember
And
about
it's
withdrawing
psychiatric
from.
drugs.
from-
Something,
Something
how
like
to
that.
get off, I'm not sure exactly what, but
Right.
with those three words, if you look his name up, Joe Glenn Mullen, on, any of the book-selling sites or whatever, you will find and you'll recognize immediately which book it is.
So from a practical clinical experience, since I do this all the time, it's, again, tricky. I started there and I took myself off in a little bit different direction. You have to slowly come off, and at the same, slowly, like 3 weeks at least, and at the same time, get person on a program that is rebuilding their neurotransmitters, because the antidepressants specifically suppress certain neurotransmitter systems, okay? And it also disorganizes your neurotransmitter function. So what I do is I slowly take people up and I give them, one, the good nutrition, and that my best results are with vegan live food nutrition baseline. And then we give certain amino acids and omega-3s, and usually you have a lot of mineral deficiencies and things like, I always give people iodine, a certain form of that, which I call luminine and stuff like that, that really makes the system begin to work again. Okay? So these are all things that you do, and you have to kind of take this away and add that. And it takes about 3 to 6 months to get a stabilized result. But you really do need to replace it. That's the problem with alcohol. You do alcohol withdrawal and you're not replacing it, they're just white-knuckle alcoholics.
Yep.
Okay? And they have the same amount of suicide and people still drinking. But you take people and you replace all the deficiencies, and their suicide rate goes way, way down. And the same thing happens here. So there has to be a rebuilding of the system to adequately withdraw. And then each person's a little different in that. And suddenly, whatever the neurotransmitters are down, you have to sort that out and rebuild those. And what I do is I give them the building blocks. And when you give the building blocks, then it starts to activate the person's system, and it starts to stimulate a brain regrowth and reprogramming. Because remember, it does alter the brain structure as well. It takes a little time. People have to be patient. A lot of people say, I want to stop, and they stop now. It's like, oh, please, let's not create a crisis here. Now, some people can do that, incidentally, but you don't know who can and who can't. So it's better to go slowly and patiently and build up the system over 3 to 6 months. That's kind of, and it's a very high percentage of success if people do that.
Okay, you both were right on the books. The one is The Antidepressant Solution, a Step-by-Step Guide to Safety, and the other one is Prozac, Backlash, Overcoming the blah, blah, blah.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here and doing this. This is just great knowledge for everybody. I recently heard on NPR radio that in Australia, they're making vaccines for children mandatory, and that the parents would have government funding taken away from them if they did not vaccine, and that
And also Israel. They just did it in Israel, too.
and that doctors were going to have to start blowing the whistle on their patients that didn't vaccine. And I wanted to know, it's horrible for any country, I believe, but do you see any kind of mandatory medical intervention being put in this country? And, I mean, people already think they have to vaccine here. They don't realize they do still have a choice. They just do it. But there's, in this state, I know with my own children, I went and got a little blue card and said, we're Christian Scientists, so now we don't vaccinate, But thank you.
Well, I think there's over 100 bills currently in legislation in various states to make vaccines mandatory for adults and children. So that's the most that I can give you on that information, is that I've recently done some research, and that's what I found. So it's very highly likely that if those bills go through, that you will see states and/or, the federal government making those mandates.
So the Nuremberg principles after World War II is that you actually can't do that. You can't give medical care without consent. So it will be very interesting to see if we're
Right.
able to hold hold to those principles.
I'm going to be an upcoming biomedical student this year, and for people like me or other people seeking to join the healthcare field or even aspiring to be physicians, what kind of advice can you offer, insight can you give us while we go on this journey when we're going to face like pharmaceutical grooming or corruption and that? How can we resist that and really help people?
Remind yourself there's no such thing as a free lunch, because you're going to have lots of people coming around offering you a free lunch.
Okay.
Okay, and just remember that that smiling face that's there, that's calling you by name and knows your children and knows where you go to the gym and where you attend church and what organizations you belong to, they have a vested interest in knowing you so that they can manipulate you and influence you. And so if you want to have those relationships, that's fine, but don't take their goodies and don't fall prey to the disinformation campaigns by depending on those individuals for your information. Do your own due diligence.
Thank you.
I think there's also so much of medical training, unfortunately, is more like being you're supposed to learn a tribal form of thinking. In other words, you're not to be a critical thinker, but you're to learn whatever is the body of wisdom at the time, which makes you a good one who sort of repeats what they've learned. I think the best doctors are critical thinkers.
I agree.
They really, they have that honed, and they really try to analyze things. And so that's the biggest thing I would say to young doctors: be critical thinkers and understand that the medical wisdom of the day, as Irving put up a thing, often doesn't survive the test of time at all.
And I would add to that, as a student in particular, not only the best doctors, but the best teachers are critical thinkers. And my experience, having been a teacher for many, many years, is the best students are critical thinkers. And so I would say, I would, as someone entering into a school system of that sort, I would say, think critically, keep an open mind, look for alternative viewpoints, and look at the data. Look
the
at
most
the
important
data.
thing.
The data eventually will tell you what you need to know.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name is Victoria Shaw, and I also want to say thank you so much for your time here. God bless each and every one of you. I was just wondering if you all had, if you knew what quantum reflexology analysis is, and if you did, what your opinion on that was.
We all look at Dr. Cousens. I don't know. I have no clue.
Never heard of it.
Dr. Cousens? Well, I know you'd know.
Yeah. I'm trying to stay away from like one thing over another that way. It's good.
Okay.
I'll just leave it that way. I think it's a good thing, and I support people doing it.
I've had it done, and I definitely highly recommend it for anybody who's interested. I think Dr. Cousens could probably explain it a little bit better than I, but...
Maybe taking us a little bit off direction here. But I do want to add a little bit about the withdrawal issue. And the other thing I try to help people look at, because there are different kinds of depressions. There's endogenous depression, which really has a genetic aspect, which I kind of mentioned, like the D2-1A1 allele. There's a situational depression. There's grief that kind of moves on and gets into depression. There's a variety of things, and also post-traumatic stress syndrome that has depression. There are lots of different things. So when you take people off drugs and you are in a healing process, it's very important that they have support in dealing with the psychological part and also the spiritual part that had been suppressed, and help them kind of reconnect at that level. And those people, I always do that, but the point is they do the best in the big picture because they're having a more total healing rather than just the nutritional support, which is very, very important. So it's more of a holistic approach. And if you can help people overcome the cause of the depression from a psycho-spiritual point of view, which is definitely doable, it makes a big difference, because then they're healed on a deeper level.
I'd like to ask each of you to make a final statement just on your thoughts. We've spoken for quite a long time on some very, very meaningful information that I think is not generally discussed in the mainstream, so this is really valuable to have all four of you at the same time validating it so we could really feel comfortable. If you could maybe give us your closing thoughts on anything, each of you.
I've really come to realize that the thing that we can do to really make the paradigm shift most quickly is to take personal responsibility. We have been acculturated to hand our power over to authority figures and to let other people do our thinking for us. As these gentlemen said, I'm a critical thinker. I applaud other critical thinkers. And I think it's important for us to take control and responsibility for our own bodies, for our families, for our children, and to stop letting other people do our thinking for us. You are a magnificent spiritual being here having a human experience. You have been disempowered intentionally to make you easily controlled. And there are people who have vested interests to use you as a commodity for profiteering. And you have to take a stand against that morally and step outside of your fear-based thinking, because there's no reason to be afraid to do your own thinking and to make your own decisions.
Gee, what can I say after that? I'm serious about that. I'm at a loss for words. I have only one word that I can say, and that is ditto.
This is the hard act to follow. Very eloquent. Thank you. Adding to that, not instead of, but adding to it, is the importance, I'm going to say, of expanding consciousness. There is a struggle going on in the world about expanding. There's a force of I speak all over the world, it's like there's a force of people waking up, and it's very exciting. And understanding that there are real movement. So I'm taking a very optimistic point of view here, or maybe not so optimistic, just reality is suggesting more and more people are waking up. And it's a time to hold strong and keep expanding your consciousness. And in that process, we begin to heal ourselves and create a field of love for the healing of the whole planet. And it becomes a whole holistic and integrated process. And so it takes courage, which is what we're really talking about. It takes courage to stay in the truth. It takes courage to find the truth, but to stay in the truth, to trust your inner experiences in a world that's saying, basically, none of what you know inside is true, is to say, no, not at all. Everything I know inside has great truth and power, and I need to live in a way that brings me back into harmony with the living planet and with all culture. I hope.
I should just do like Irving and say ditto, and that'd be done. No, I mean, basically, I think, for me, coming here is just a reminder of what's at stake, and so much is at stake. I mean, one thing what Gwen is talking about, we do live in an environment where we're treated as consumers, and markets are built. And so in psychiatry, you know, they take pretty ordinary things and then they build markets out of that, larger markets for antidepressants. We clearly, if you look at antidepressants, for example, in the early 90s, basically they thought the market for adults for antidepressants was saturated, and the drug companies, as you know, began talking about what's the untapped market? Kids. So it wasn't the idea we're going to really help kids, because the trials of antidepressants in kids were really quite dispiriting. That didn't start it. So what's at stake is, as a people, we have become treated as a market. I think it's doing, in the psychiatric world, a great harm to us. It's a horrible philosophy of being. It diminishes resilience. It turns kids and it tells them that they're not resilient. So for me, once again, is that there's a huge battle going on out there. And are we going to be a people that is sort of treated as a market? Or are we going to embrace something much richer, some of the things that Dr. Cousens was talking about, and remember this richness of life? And that's the battle, I think, and it's a really extraordinary battle. And the final thing for me is I keep thinking about, at least as adults, we sort of make choices. The kids aren't making choices today, and they're being raised in an environment that is just awful for kids. So my thing is, what's being discussed here is really profound. It's what sort of society are we going to be? What sort of philosophy of being are we going to be? How are we going to organize ourselves as a society? So I sort of wish you had your original hope for numbers, and that would have been even a fuller group here, because it's so important to us as a society.